The afternoon sun painted everything gold across the farmland, where Eleanor Hayes had spent 40 years of her life building something beautiful with her late husband Thomas. And now she stood there alone, watching three young men approach her vegetable stand, with trouble written all over their faces. Eleanor was 62 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that knew honest work. And her daughter Claire stood beside her, arranging the tomatoes they had picked that morning, while their golden retriever Daisy dozed in the shade. The men were in their 20s, wearing too much denim and too little respect, and the tallest one kicked over a basket of apples before Eleanor could even speak. "This land belongs to the county now, old woman," he sneered with a voice full of meanness. "You got 30 days to clear out, and we're here to make sure you understand." Eleanor held her ground, even though her heart was hammering because Thomas had taught her that backing down from bullies only made them stronger, and she raised her chin and said quietly, "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the papers to prove it." The second man laughed and pushed her hard enough that she stumbled backward into the vegetable table, and Claire cried out and rushed to her mother's side, while Daisy started barking with all the fury her old body could muster. "Mom, are you okay?" Claire whispered, helping Eleanor stand, and there was fear in her daughter's eyes that broke Eleanor's heart more than any physical pain could. The third man grabbed a handful of tomatoes and started throwing them at the farmhouse windows, while the leader shoved Eleanor again, and this time she fell to her knees in the dirt she had tended for decades, and Claire was crying now, begging them to stop. But they just laughed. That was when the truck pulled up. It was an old Ford pickup, painted forest green, and it stopped right there at the edge of the property line, and a man stepped out, followed by the biggest German shepherd Eleanor had ever seen. And something about the way he moved told her this was someone who had seen real trouble and knew exactly how to handle it. His name was Daniel Cross, and he was 48 years old, with gray touching his temples and eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held kindness, and he had been a Navy SEAL for 20 years before retiring to find some peace in the countryside, and his canine partner Rex had served 3 tours with him, saving lives and taking down bad guys who thought they were untouchable. Daniel took in the scene with one sweep of those careful eyes and saw everything that mattered, and Eleanor on her knees and Claire crying, and 3 men who were about to learn a lesson their fathers should have taught them long ago. "Gentlemen," Daniel said in a voice that was softer than a whisper, but harder than steel, "I think you should leave." The tallest one turned and laughed and said, "Who's gonna make us, old man?" But his voice had already lost some of its confidence because Rex had stepped forward and was watching them with the kind of focus that meant business. "Nobody needs to make you," Daniel replied, walking slowly toward them with Rex at his side. "You're going to choose to leave because that's what decent people do when they realize they've made a mistake." The second man reached for Eleanor again, and that was his error because Rex moved faster than seemed possible and was suddenly between them with teeth showing and a growl that came from somewhere deep and ancient, and the man froze like he had touched an electric fence. Daniel helped Eleanor to her feet with gentle hands that had once diffused bombs and carried wounded brothers, and he asked, "Are you hurt, ma'am?" And Eleanor shook her head even though her knees were scraped and her pride was bruised. "This isn't your business," the leader said, but he was backing up now because Daniel had that look that combat veterans carry, and it said he had faced down worse things than playground bullies pretending to be men. "A woman and her daughter being assaulted on their own property," Daniel said. "That's everybody's business, and right now it's mine." Claire had her phone out and was filming everything, and she said in a shaky voice, "I've got all of this recorded, including the threats and the assault, and I'm calling Sheriff Morrison right now." The 3 men looked at each other and suddenly realized they had made a terrible miscalculation, and the leader tried one more time, saying, "We were hired to deliver a message about the land dispute." But Daniel cut him off. "There's delivering a message and there's assault," he said. "And I saw assault, and Rex here saw assault, and that camera saw assault. So here's what's going to happen next." He stepped closer, and Rex moved with him like they were one unit, and Daniel continued, "You're going to apologize to these ladies, and then you're going to leave. And if I ever hear about you coming back here or bothering them again, I'm going to make it my personal mission to ensure every law enforcement agency in 3 counties knows exactly who you are and what you did." The men mumbled something that might have been an apology and stumbled back to their truck and drove away, throwing dust and shame behind them. And Eleanor felt her legs go weak, and Daniel caught her arm and helped her to a chair they kept by the vegetable stand. Claire brought water, and Eleanor drank it gratefully, and Daisy came over and put her head in Eleanor's lap like she was trying to help heal the hurt with love. And Rex sat down beside them, keeping watch like the guardian he had been trained to be. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and her voice cracked. "Thank you so much." Daniel knelt down so he was at her eye level and said, "No thanks needed, ma'am, and I just did what anyone should do." But Eleanor knew better because she had lived long enough to know that not everyone stepped up when it mattered. And not everyone had the courage to face down trouble for a stranger, and she reached out and took his hand and said, "You're a good man, Daniel Cross." He looked surprised that she knew his name, and she smiled and said, "Small town and people talk, and they say you moved into the old Miller place last month and that you're looking for peace after serving our country." Daniel nodded and said, "Trying to find it anyway." Sheriff Morrison arrived 20 minutes later and took statements and watched Claire's video and promised that those men would face charges, and he thanked Daniel for being there and said, "We need more folks like you around here." After the sheriff left, Eleanor insisted that Daniel stay for dinner, and he tried to decline. But Claire added her voice saying, "Please, and Mom makes the best pot roast you've ever tasted, and it's the least we can do." So Daniel agreed. They ate on the back porch as the sun set over the fields Thomas had loved, and Eleanor told stories about the farm and raising Claire, and the hard years after Thomas died. And Daniel listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes people just needed to be heard. Claire asked about his service, and Daniel shared what he could and the parts that weren't classified or too painful. And he talked about Rex, and how they had found each other and become partners and family. And Rex lay at his feet looking content in a way that suggested he had found his peace too. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. "Now that you're here trying to find your quiet." Daniel looked out at the land and said, "I thought maybe I'd help people and do odd jobs and carpentry and farming if anyone needs a hand, and just try to be useful in a way that doesn't involve weapons and danger." Eleanor's eyes lit up, and she said, "We could use help around here. And the fence needs mending, and the barn roof leaks, and there's always more work than 2 women can handle." And before Daniel could protest, she added, "We'd pay you fair wages, and you'd be doing us a real service." And that was how Daniel Cross found his purpose in the quiet countryside, working alongside Eleanor and Claire, and teaching them things Thomas had known but never had time to pass on, and learning from them the patience and gentleness that only comes from nurturing, growing things. Over the following months, the farm flourished again, and Eleanor's laughter returned, and Claire met a nice young teacher from town, and Daniel found that his nightmares came less frequently, and that Rex had learned to herd chickens, which was somehow hilarious and healing all at once. The 3 men never came back, and the land dispute was resolved in Eleanor's favor because it turned out they had been hired by a developer who was running a scam, and Sheriff Morrison made sure justice was served. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the dusk, Eleanor said, "You know, Daniel, when you drove up that day, I thought maybe Thomas had sent you." Daniel smiled and said maybe he did. "He would have liked you," Eleanor continued. "He always said that real strength was about protecting people, not hurting them." "He sounds like he was a wise man," Daniel replied. "He was," Eleanor agreed. "And you remind me of him in the ways that matter most." They sat in comfortable silence while Rex and Daisy chased fireflies, and Claire hummed in the kitchen making her famous apple pie, and somewhere in the gentle rhythm of ordinary moments, Daniel Cross found what he had been searching for all along. Peace and purpose and a place to call home where kindness still mattered, and where an old widow and her daughter had shown him that families aren't always born, but sometimes they're built by people who choose to show up when it counts and stay when it matters. And that was the best kind of love there was.